All right, so we're gonna start with a little bit of background.
Okay.
What does gloving mean to you? Like, what is it about? What is it for?
Jeez. Well, I got into gloving about 3 years ago before I even really learned about the rave scene. My friends were just into it as like another mode of expression. At that time, I was getting really into swing dance and public speaking, and these were all very self expressive things. And when I landed on it, it was just another mode of self expression. It was a way to kind of like feel the movement of your body in a really distinctive way. I really like the curves and the angles that you're able to get through it because that's like a type of movement that your body can't normally do. And for me, expression is all about like mining the body and the mind for however much expression you can find. And it was just such a distinctive form of expression that it's something that I really wanted to pick up. And it kind of started there.
So you would consider it almost a dance form as an art form.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's the closest thing I can relate it to. It's not exactly a dance because you're not really doing it with another person. It's more of like I play the guitar and I feel like it's closer to that than anything else because it's a way for you to bring like that motion and that sense of rhythm inside of yourself out into a new, unique, expressive way.
Very interesting. So, with regard to the stigmas surrounding the gloving and the rave scene, have there been times when you feel judged or had preconceived notions thrown at you about the gloving community when they heard that you are a glover?
Oh, absolutely. A couple of times in college, I brought my gloves to a party because I thought that would be a cool way to like introduce myself to other people. And some people kind of turned their nose up towards it because it was associated with something of a drug culture, and they didn't want to be associated with that or associated with some paraphernalia that I guess was attached to it, and that hurt because originally I didn't look at it as something even relatively connected to that. It was just like another cool movement form. And I mean, I guess I do understand where the stigma comes from because there's a lot of connectivity between the two things. I mean, they usually appear in scenarios where there are a lot of substances, but they're not connected innately, at least in my experience. And some people see them as innately connected and get into it for that reason, but you can say the same thing about almost every art form, so it doesn't bother me.
Okay. How have you been personally impacted by this association that people make between gloves and raving and drugs? Do you think that association is unfair or is it more accurate?
That's tough. Let me start off by saying that the majority of art forms that have progressed in society have done so alongside the use of substances. Um, Modern music, dance culture, visual artistry, really anything that has that visual or expressive medium. So many great minds have even used drugs to change their way of thinking and elevate it or alter it so they can think about their art form in a different sense. I mean, some of the most famous dances, some of the most important cultural dances were a result of people being under the influence to connect to God. I mean, tribal cultures have used substances in dance to be these evocative representations of their spirit and their society. So, I've never really had a problem with that interplay because I feel like any real art form usually goes through that step. But socially, yeah, there have been some problems. Sometimes when people see that I glove, they turn their nose up towards it and think that I'm just someone who uses drugs and it's a thing that I do. Like it's a connective thing. And it's kind of unfortunate because you wouldn't look at like a ballerina and think they're doing this because it's a good high. It's just another expressive art form. Though, I mean, also, it's given me a lot of good opportunities to talk about myself, I guess. Because a lot of the time when people do come into something with a bit of a stigma associated with it, but, it's an art form that demands a little bit of observation to understand, as long as they're willing to give me the time of day to look at it, they usually change their opinion by the end of it because it really is, it's artistry. it's self-expression. It's something that you don't see every day. It's a very distinct form of identity, and I feel like people are more good-willed than we give them credit for. And when they get the opportunity to look at that type of unique type of identity, as long as they're willing to suspend their disbelief for just a minute, they usually come to terms with it and think that it's just another cool thing that exists in this world.
So you'd say then that you've had some experience changing people's minds about gloving?
No, absolutely. In the same scenario that I was talking about before, the parties, normally there's hesitation when I first pull them out. Some people like get away from that scenario, but there's like one or two enthusiastic people that walk up and really want to light show. And when people watch it from the sidelines, they get really enthusiastic, and then they start lining up and they want one as well. And that's cool, because it's not just hesitation, it's also like, in a sense, a form of argumentation for the art style itself. And the argument is the art. And I think a lot of great art has the same thing attached to it.
Very good, very good. So in what ways would you say that this connection that people make between gloves and drugs, what does it do to detract from our art form?
I think it does what it does to a lot of niche art forms. It just stops it from being circulated in the social public sphere. Like, you would very rarely see a gloving video hit viral status on Facebook, because there's always going to be that stigma associated with it. Or at least at the moment there's that stigma associated with it. And it stops it from being a recognized part of our culture. It kind of gets relegated to this weird, almost underground art culture that can only be discussed by people in the know. I think that's a little tragic, honestly, because there are a lot of great fringe art forms that are kind of pushing the boundary of what it means to express, because they're associated with things unjustly, and people miss out on the opportunity to learn more about forms of self-expression, and as a result it kind of cheapens and diminishes the full impact of what human expression is, which is just so dynamic and so big and includes so many great things like gloving.
So then that would mean that you would think that the association that people make between these fringe art forms like gloving halts its ability to become more public through any social circles. It's less accepted.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not any social circles. There's always going to be like circles that find them interesting, and the individual isn't controlled by the circles that they exist in. They always have, a curious mind that might stumble upon something like this, and that's usually how people get into a culture like this. But in terms of mass proliferation, in the way that we respect evolving art forms, yeah, it's just kind of esoteric, it's kind of fringe, and it's just kind of halted.
Okay, so then how would you say that, if you had to give an overview, what is the general public's opinion of us? What do they see us as when, like, the masses are introduced to gloving? Is it an overly negative opinion, or is it more just, oh, hey, a weird art form?
I don't really know, honestly, because in my experience, and this is not like an objective truth, I think you need more survey to figure this out, but gloving, is generally associated with the rave scene. The lights are generally associated with a type of light displays that are put on at those shows and those concerts. So people see the two things married to each other, and every stigma that someone probably attaches to the rave scene is probably carried into their opinion of gloving culture. And it's probably made worse by the fact that most people think that gloving is just something for people who are on drugs. And probably makes it like even fringe amidst this fringe culture of rave culture. But it's getting better. Like, people are starting to accept festival and rave culture more as like the mainstream. It's kind of started to become like a hallmark of this generation, almost like a pilgrimage that people make at a particular age to go be part of like the social world, since it is one of the most popular forms of, festival and celebration we're seeing right now. But it's still part of the fringe, and it's still put on the sideline.
Okay, so do you think that these stigma would harm the community in any way? Do they build it up, or are they null? Do they just not affect us in any way? Or what are your thoughts on how it affects the gloving community?
There's a lot to that. I think in the negative, it stops the community from, being proliferated, as we've talked about at length, and stops our art form from being accepted more generally, and maybe involved and evolved in the kind of like the social cultural voice that allows art forms to progress. Like, it wasn't until like art museums started popping up and visual media started becoming like the main art form of a generation that we started having these large cultural discussions about the evolution of that art form that let it make massive strides. And I feel like gloving might be inhibited in that way as a result of its relegation to the sideline. Neutrally, people are still doing it, and they're still gonna do it. There's still like that indignance about whatever the social stigma is, and I think that there's honestly like this fringe movement that is okay with that. And I think that's actually a positive. And that was the positive that I was going to bring up too. There seems to be this conjoined identity that comes from doing something that isn't necessarily mainstream. That's part of why people like the identity, because it gives them something unique about themselves that they can hang their hat on, and gives them a way to express themselves in a very unique, dynamic way that so many won't. And there's always this lamb blasting against an art form or anything really going mainstream, because it usually takes away the culture, the cultural element of it, because there is this like sentiment behind people that do things that are, one, sometimes frowned upon, and two, esoteric in their own nature and indicative of creating its own subculture. And these glovers, all of us glovers, like when you meet another glover at a show, it's probably one of the most magical things that I've experienced, because you like throw some lights for them, you do your moves, and you show them what you've been working on. And I was at a festival with a friend one time, and we laughed after meeting a couple of other glovers, and we were like, that's pretty much the coolest handshake you can imagine, because it's your hands aren't touching, it's just a melding of minds, seeing what you've been focusing on, seeing what type of representations really stick with you, and you see so much about that person in it. And yeah, it'd be cool to include more people in that, but at the same time, it's kind of nice having that special element to it, knowing that this is another person that's chosen to be here, that's chosen to go a little bit against the fray and be a part of this. And that's powerful. I think that's what a lot of art forms seek in the first place, just that power of community.
Okay. So then you would say that you've had experiences changing people's minds before at parties,
Mm-hmm.
When they're reluctant or hesitant, and then they end up liking it. Do you find that easy to do with gloving? Is gloving enough of an attraction, enough of a draw to sway the average mind over to our side as an art form?
Yeah. But I mean, I think there's a pretty big distinction between swaying someone's mind in the moment when they might be receptive to it, and changing the attitude about the art form as a whole. Because the people who are in those environments are already kind of usually susceptible to it. It's a party. You're kind of dropping your reservation a little bit to be with people in a communal sense. I saw a video, though, of a woman who was using light gloves in a kindergarten class, using them as a demonstration of different forms of expression and personality. I think that's more what would destroy the stigma. When they kind of come out into the real world and it kind of evolves from like the one social space that it's already in, like the party scene or the rave scene, when it becomes something more about the person than just the one environment that it exists in. So I think it's like the marriedness to the environment right now that's really causing the damage.
So in order to move forward with our community and build a future for ourselves with this art form, when wanting to avoid these associations, is that what would help do that is to introduce it to other venues, like you say, like a kindergarten teacher showing as a form of expression. How else might we avoid these negative associations that we don't approve of?
Well, some of them are generated by the community themselves. Like, some of the terminology that we use is definitely aimed at drug culture, like face melting, for example, or melting of minds. You know, those are terms that are literally associated with drug culture because they kind of put someone in a trance. Maybe changing the terminology a little bit, bringing it out into other social spaces, doing performances, or making it larger in a way that could evolve past the community. But once again, I sometimes wonder if that is even what the community would want. Because it is its own. Like, the cultural identity would change if that happens. And sometimes it's okay to accept a little bit of a detriment to your art form if it maintains the communal nature of it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for your thoughts and opinions on these issues. You've been a great audience and a great help. Looking forward to seeing how this interview plays out.